Hey, what's up, everybody? Brian here with Practically Biblical, and today we're starting a series on the last week of Jesus' life, and today I'm going to share with you more about the event that was kind of the beginning of the end for Jesus. Stick around, we'll get right into it. Hey, welcome back. I'm excited to get into this one, but if you're new here, let me first tell you what this channel is all about. On this channel, I share stories of Scripture through creative teaching and offer practical tools, tips, and insights to help you grow in your knowledge and understanding of the Bible. So if that's something that you're interested in, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on that notification bell for new videos every Wednesday. If you've been around a while, you'll notice that I'm trying on a whole new set today, and actually will be for a series of videos. I'm starting with this one on the final days of Jesus' life before he was crucified. I thought I'd go simple and just try and keep it real for y'all. So with that said, let's jump into it and talk about the event that marked the beginning of the end for Jesus. We're going to pick up the story in John chapter 11, but we know from John chapter 10 that Jesus was hanging out on the other side of the Jordan River and keeping his distance from Jerusalem for a while because, let's just say, there was some trouble the last time he was there that he was able to narrowly escape. But while he was away, he got word that his friend Lazarus was deathly ill, and he was summoned by Mary and Martha, the sisters of Lazarus, to come and visit before it was too late. As John recalled the story in his gospel, he wrote that Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard the news that Jesus was sick, he immediately set out for their home. Except that's not what it said, and that's not what Jesus did. In fact, it says when he heard the news that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was for 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, "All right, now let's go back to Judea." So Jesus made plans to return to the town of Bethany in Judea where Mary and Martha lived, which caused the 12 some stress. Because Bethany was really close to Jerusalem, and they knew that there was a high probability that if they went there again, Jesus at least wouldn't make it out alive, and maybe none of them would. But then Jesus told them why they needed to go. John recalls the story with a bit of dark humor, and I'll paraphrase. Jesus told us that our friend Lazarus had fallen asleep and that we needed to go wake him up, which we thought was kind of weird. So we said, if he's fallen asleep, he'll wake up, Jesus. What's the big deal? So Jesus told us plainly, Lazarus is dead. And as if we didn't already feel bad enough, Jesus went on to say, and for your sake, I'm glad I wasn't there so that you will finally believe. But they had no idea what would happen next. As they approached the town a week or so later, Martha ran out to meet Jesus. And though she was glad to see him, she was also quite frustrated that he waited so long, because at that point, Lazarus was already dead. So she sort of let Jesus have it. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." You see, she had been witness to many of Jesus' miracles before this and had heard stories of countless others when Jesus healed the sick, gave sight to the blind, and even raised the dead. But even that hope was gone because the dead Jesus raised prior to this had just died, like they were freshly dead. He raised Jairus' daughter who had died just before he arrived, and another young man during his funeral procession before he was buried. But at this point, Lazarus' funeral was long over, and his body had been in a tomb for 4 days already. But even then, Jesus promised Martha that her brother would rise again. And John recorded here a really significant bit of dialogue between the two of them. And Martha believed in a resurrection of the dead in the last days and thought that that's what Jesus was talking about when he said that her brother would rise, and thought that Jesus was just trying to comfort her. But Jesus said, "Martha, I am the resurrection and the life." And then he asked her a really significant question, which I'll get back to in just a minute, because I don't think the question was just for Martha. I think Martha left that interaction frustrated. The text tells us she turned and went back home with no indication that she invited Jesus and his crew back to the house as she had done so many times before. She left him standing there and went back to tell her sister Mary that Jesus was in town and he was asking for her. So Mary ran out and had a very similar encounter with Jesus. She called him out for not coming sooner and let him know that if he had not been so slow to show up, their brother would still be alive. And there was no argument from Jesus. He simply asked where Lazarus' body was laid, and when he arrived, he wept. His friend Lazarus lay dead in a tomb, and his family blamed him for it. Even the onlookers, the people in the crowd who saw Jesus weeping and knew how much he cared for him, recalled the time Jesus gave sight to a blind man and shook their heads, wondering why Jesus couldn't or didn't stop his friend Lazarus from dying. But then Jesus composed himself. He stood up and asked that the stone that sealed the tomb be taken away. And Martha tried to stop the madness. Remember, the body had been there for 4 days. Decay was setting in, and it started to smell terrible. But in that moment, it was Jesus' time to call her out with gentleness and conviction, with a question. Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? As a stone was rolled away, Jesus began to pray, loud enough for all to hear, that they would know exactly what was happening in that moment, and that they would all believe in who he is. Then in a loud voice, he called out directly to the dead man, Lazarus, come out. And right then, the once dead but alive again Lazarus, still wrapped in his grave clothes, walked out of the tomb. All who witnessed were amazed. Some were speechless, others were gasping, many celebrated, and Jesus directed them to take off the grave clothes and let him go, because Lazarus was once again alive and free. And here's where things get interesting, because not everyone in the crowd that day was so excited about what they had just seen. Some felt threatened and desired to put an end to Jesus, and they seized the opportunity. So they returned to Jerusalem, and they reported the miraculous events of the day to the high priest. And John wrote that from that day on, the high priest and his officials plotted to take Jesus' life, and they gave orders for anyone who knew where Jesus was to report it immediately. Isn't it ironic that the act of giving life to a dead man was the same act that triggered their plans to take his life from him? Now let's get back to the question that Jesus asked Martha. Remember, in that moment that he asked her this question, she was upset with him for not being there when they needed him the most. Her brother was dead and was in the grave for 4 days. And that's when Jesus said, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Then he asked the question. It was directed at Martha just then, but it's a question every one of us must answer for ourselves. Do you believe this? Our answer to that question has eternal significance. And it's one thing to say, yes, I believe, but it's a whole other thing to truly orient your life around it. Martha said she believed, and just moments later witnessed Jesus, the resurrection and the life, command her dead brother to get up and walk out of the grave. I imagine that question hit her a little differently after she saw that. And it should hit us differently today as well, because Jesus spoke many times of his own death and resurrection. And just a short time after he raised Lazarus, he was arrested, crucified, and buried. But after lying dead in a tomb just as long as Lazarus had been, he himself, the one who declared himself to be the resurrection and the life, also walked out of the grave. So let me ask you this. Do you believe this? Is it all just fantasy? The ridiculous babbling of a madman, a fairy tale perhaps? Or did it really happen? I believe it did. I believe Jesus is who he says he is. I believe it because he's shown up in my life and he's changed me. You see, the dead can only be remembered, but the living can change lives. I'd love to talk with you more about this, to hear your thoughts, your doubts, your questions, maybe even to hear how Jesus has changed your life. So hit me up in the comments or message me on Instagram and let's chat. I'm not one to argue or try and convince you. I'm just here to share what I believe about Jesus and invite anyone who desires to walk with me in his direction. If you're interested in hearing more, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you can follow along in this series as we journey through the last week of Jesus' life. And that'll just about do it for this episode of Practically Biblical. If you made it this far, be sure to like this video and leave me an emoji in the comments to let me know you watched to the end. And I'll see you in the next video.